webinar titled Fast, Flexible SAP Workflow Automation with SharePoint. In this webinar, we will show you how to build complex workflows by leveraging and integrating Microsoft SharePoint and SAP without any programming. My name is Teresa Shockey, and I will be your host today. I will be going through a brief introduction of key performance indicators, an overview of the Winshuttle solution. I would also like to introduce our solutions engineer, Bill Wiseman. Bill will be going through a product demonstration highlighting the features and the functionality of our product. Let's quickly run through the agenda of our webinar. First, we will highlight SharePoint and SAP and why to integrate. Then we will have our Winshuttle workflow forms demonstration, highlighting the features and the benefits. We'll follow up with a summary and answer any questions that you have. As a reminder, please use the question and answer box on your GoToWebinar control panel to ask your questions at any time. We will do our best to answer in real time. So let's go ahead and get started. First, I want to talk about why integrate SAP and SharePoint. Now, SAP is clearly the system of record for a majority of corporate enterprises today. It is an ERP leader in terms of business functionality. It's a proven and stable technology that companies use to run their business across the globe. It has also built up a large ecosystem of people that can supply, configure, and add to SAP, which is very helpful. And it also has a lot of industry solutions. However, with this complexity comes challenges. First is SAP has a complex user interface and often leads to challenges for companies with getting data into SAP in a timely manner. As a result of this, it also affects the quality of data, which can interfere with the ability to make decisions. SAP has a numerous amount of workflow tools within itself, but they are very difficult and technical to build and use. SAP workflow is not suitable for managing processes outside of SAP. And finally, SAP is only used by a limited number of employees in an organization. The average is about 20% of all employees of a large organization are SAP license holders. Well, on the other hand, there's SharePoint, and SharePoint is becoming the enterprise portal of choice. In comparison to SAP, it has a simple web-based UI. It has a lot of collaboration tools within it. It is easy to configure and supported by IT. It is easy to administrate, and like SAP, it has a large ecosystem of third-party vendors to be called upon to help configure and adjust. Unlike SAP, it is licensed across the whole enterprise, so nearly everyone in the organization has the ability to access a SharePoint site. Its model is collaborating both the business unit and IT to streamline business processes and development. On the downside, SharePoint is not an ERP system. It is not designed as a system of record, and while it does have some workflow capabilities, that too has its limitations. So if you are able to bring both SAP and SharePoint together and get the best of both worlds, we think that there is a huge opportunity to leverage the best components of these two systems. For example, with SAP and SharePoint integration, one of the great things you can provide users with a single web-based entry point and store data within your SAP system of record. You can expand the number of participants of an SAP process because you have people have access to their web-based interface. You can also leverage the investment of SAP and Microsoft technologies that you've already made. And finally, you can improve business processes and make your enterprise more efficient. When companies start to engage us, first they must uncover and answer a simple question. How are we doing it today, and does this process we have in place make sense for the future and the business of the company? Typically, we engage with our clients. We hear different ways that they're doing workflows, and soon we begin to discover that Winshuttle can solve the problem of being stuck in custom programming that's expensive to develop and very costly to implement. Any paper-based workflows with no rich content for reporting, an email-based workflow with having the capabilities for any kind of approval or notification status, and also just the electronic workflows that are not robust, that are just too simple or generic. So what is Winshuttle Workflow? What can I do? With Winshuttle Workflow, you can enforce virtually any business process with the capabilities to route documents and forms in electronic workflow. Also being able to see at a glance who did what and when. It gives you a timeline of where things are in a process, and from there you're able to dissect that process and see where any bottlenecks reside. Winshuttle Workflow makes it easy to adapt to changes in business processes, which we all know can happen quite frequently. It decreases work cycle times and increases workplace efficiency. Also, it can help you get your products and services out to market quicker. Winshuttle Workflow provides an efficient, reliable, and cost-effective means to create virtually any type of role-based business process without software coding or consulting. Here is just a list of examples of where we've seen Winshuttle Workflow placed in some of our clients' environments. Some of you can relate to these processes, and keep in mind when you're going through this webinar today, other processes in your company that could be automated. Here's just an example of a new vendor request form. With Winshuttle Workflow, you have the capability to route this form through several approvals, change form views from each person that it touches, and load the information into SAP. Okay, so without further ado, we can really dive into the features and the functionality of Winshuttle. I'm going to go ahead and pass the baton over to Bill Wiseman, my colleague, to run through our solutions demonstration.
Thank you, Teresa.
My pleasure, Bill.
Thank you very much. So I guess everyone can hear me okay, and you can see my screen, Teresa?
Absolutely.
All right, perfect. So as Teresa was saying, we're going to demonstrate Winshuttle workflow solution this morning, and the way we're going to approach this is I'm going to give you an example of a workflow process that's first from a user perspective. So it's already been built. We're going to walk through the process the way the end user would experience it. Then we're going to take a look at how would we, as an author of this process, build out an end-to-end workflow scenario. And as Teresa mentioned, it's a very non-programmatic approach to developing not only the underlying SAP transaction, but also the design of the form as well as the design of the workflow. And so what you see here on my screen is an example of a workflow process. This is the designer solution, and this is really our blank palette, where we start, where we begin in the development of the process. And I wanted to show you what you're going to be seeing first in that end user example. So what you see here is a series of workflow steps in this process that I will show you, so that you can see that there's multiple participants in the process, from the originator to the master data team to the master data governance manager to accounting to operations, and then finally through the actual creation of the master data record within the SAP system. Now, within this process, you can see several steps where information is being added. There's approval steps in this particular process here. There is a sub-process by which there are different participants: accounting, plant controlling, the master data governance team. So we're going to walk through this example, but I just kind of wanted to show you graphically the steps that you will experience in this end user example. So I'm going to go ahead and close this example. So from a user perspective, the end user is going to have access to a central database, a central storage site, a central access point for the forms and workflow. So basically what it does is it sits in a SharePoint environment, and this is where all of our forms are stored, and basically everything that's an element of the process is stored. And in addition to that, there is some governance and compliance capability built into the solution. So it gives you, maybe as an administrator, very granular visibility and control over what your Winshuttle users are doing. So this is an example of that central environment where we would store and where we would access the form. So if I'm an end user and I have license access to this portal, I'll just simply log in to the process cockpit, and this is where I will begin my process. So I will have available to me the things that that I have access to. So maybe in this case, it might be one of these particular types of forms. Now today we're going to use a master data example, but we could just as easily use or leverage any transactional example as well. So today we're going to be creating a new material. Now, in addition to this being a central access point, it's also the place where my workflow is managed. So I'll have visibility to all the tasks that I'm responsible for in my portal site. So let's start the process. We're going to create a new material master. And because there's full integration with SAP, we really have that same capabilities that you would have as if you were navigating through the SAP GUI screen. So in this case, we have a new material creation form, and most of you probably know the MMO1 transaction. So what we have done is we have created, or we have recorded the MMO1 transaction, and then we have mapped it to a form, designed a workflow, and now it's available to my end user. In a lot of situations with regards to master data, companies will use things like reference information. So in this case, I'm able to actually query into SAP a list of available materials that I might use for the basis of my new material. So I'm going to put in a search range of materials. I'm actually going to do a fuzzy search on a range of materials with a particular description. And I'll say go out to SAP and pull back all those materials in that range that meet that fuzzy search. And so the power of Winshuttle allows me to not only to load data into SAP, but also to extract data out of SAP. So here I've actually gone out and I've read my list of available transactions or my available materials, and I'll make a selection. So I'll choose this particular material here, and I'll decide I want to deploy this first in my Plant 1000. So please go out and retrieve the description of the master data record around this particular material. and then I can pull that information back into my form, so now it's in usable format. From this point, what I'll do is I'll just take that as a basis and I'll copy it into my new material master. So think about this. What if you had to navigate through the MMO1? Well, I won't say what if you had to. This is typically what we do. Sometimes with regards to a finished good or a goods in process, there may be 25 different screens that we have to navigate through in order to populate the data that is required to create a new material in our SAP system. Well, wouldn't it be nice if we could just narrow that down, minimize it down to what exactly is required for our organization to create this new material? Now, the first person in this process is the person that's originating this creation of a material master. And this is their particular view into this new material. As you'll see as we move through the process, we can have different views for different roles of people and their responsibilities and their pertinent information in the particular view of the form. So once I've copied my data into my new creation, maybe I want to change it up a little bit. Maybe I want to go out, I want to do an F4 lookup into SAP and pull back a new industry sector. I could change any of this master data that I wanted to. And before we pass it along to the subsequent people in the process, I want to make sure my data is good. So within our solution, we can invoke a validation function which will check against SAP business rules to make sure that those rules are met before we actually move on with the creation of this new master record. And as you can see, SAP returns back to the user the log file information telling them, yes, it's successful. If we had an error in this case, it would return back that missing information. And so when you're talking about master data, and really even transactional data, but master data in particular, you know, incomplete or incorrect data in the system can be very painful later on in business processes and can actually hinder our business processes. If we have an incomplete material master, we probably can't ship any goods to a particular customer. In addition, we can also store data within our particular forms. So maybe there are drawings or documents or invoices or something of that nature that you might want to attach to and make visible to those subsequent users. We can add comments so that the following people can see our comments. You have to be able to spell. And so in this case, I showed you a graphical diagram of the workflow process before. So now we can see in list view the people that are involved. This is the same view, only in a list view. So it first goes to the master data team, the master data governance manager. Here we have the option we can actually assign someone from accounting. Now, these are possible ways of routing this particular form. Now, you can automate that process or automate that step by simply saying, based on the way a particular field, maybe if it's a finished good, it's routed to this particular individual. If it's a work in process, then maybe it's routed to a different individual. Once we've completed, or the originators completed their particular view of the form, they'll save it and route it on. Now, as I said, the portal environment is a place where we have visibility to our workflow tasks. Now remember, in this case today, I'll be playing all the parts of all the people in this process. If one of these individuals happens not to be at their desk, then there is that capability to integrate these processes, and as you can see now, there's an email notification going out to the master data group that there is a task at hand. So the resource planner in this particular plant maybe has been notified that there's a particular bit of information that they need to add. And then maybe the same thing takes place for the accountant in the process. So maybe they need to add accounting data. So what I could do is I could actually add my data, and then I could process that and return it back to this portal environment, and my changes would then be stored. So not everyone is always tied to their desk to manage their workflow tasks at hand. There's also reminders, there's escalation procedures, there's timeout policies that we can set within the workflow process to make sure that all these workflows are expedited properly. So let's log in as the accountant and take a look at the view of the accountant. Now in this case, they can see the basic information, maybe basic data 1 and 2, but they also see what's pertinent to the accounting department, maybe pricing. They need to put in a standard price, and maybe they need to put in a moving average price. Once they do that, they can again invoke that validation function to make sure what they've entered in the system meets the business rules. And then they could look at any documentation that was attached and then attach any further documentation if needed. Add some comments and then pass it along for approval. In this case, they didn't approve. They're just simply a participant adding data. At the same time, simultaneously, the resource planner from Plant 1000 receives notification that they need to add data to this particular material record. Now, in this case, their view of the material record is more around the plant information. So what kind of material is it? Is it make to stock? How are we going to acquire it? Or is it going to be in-house production? And once the master data planner has entered data into the material record, then they can validate and make sure that everything's good and then pass it along for the next person in the process, which is an approval step. Again, there's that integration throughout the process, not only within this central SharePoint environment for the task list, but also notifications via email. The next step in the process is the master data group, and they're going to either approve or disapprove or reject this particular material record. We can create loops so that if one is rejected, it might be returned back to the originator so that they can correct it, and then any of the subsequent processes. In this case, the master data group sees not only the basic data, but they also see the accounting data and the resource planning data. So different views for different people in the process. The master data group can then approve the material record, and then it's routed on finally maybe to the master data manager, who has the access to actually create this new material in SAP. So each time that I'm communicating with SAP via this form, I'm doing that via a web service. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute when we're designing the form. So in this case, the master data manager could revalidate to make sure everything was still in alignment, or they can create the new material. Again, that information is being passed, the transaction, the data within the transaction, and the user credentials associated with that transaction are passed to SAP, and then information, log information, is returned back to the user within the form itself. So now I have validation and I have an audit trail of that particular material being created. Not only do I have it here in this environment or this database, this central database, but I also have it in SAP. So it's important to remember that it's completely secure. It adheres to the auditing processes of SAP, all the business rules, all the user roles, the profiles, the authorizations that you've established for your SAP users are completely adhered to within this forms and workflow process. Once the master data team finishes, creates the new material, then they'll approve it, and it's finalized. So we walk through the multiple steps, the 5 to 6 steps of the process. At the end of the process, we not only have that audit trail in SAP, but we also have that audit trail here in the central environment. So now I can see every step, in this particular case, in list view of where we started the process, time, date stamp, who the user was, what's the status, the different steps in the process, resource planning, accounting, the master data governance approval, and then finally there was a group approval in which one of the users retrieved the form and approved it and completed the task. So we have that complete audit trail within this environment. So you've seen it from the user experience. So now what I'd like to do is show you the building of the process, the authoring of the process. So before we do that, I want to give you a visualization of what it is I'm going to show you. So the building processes within Winshuttle starts with the transaction. So at the basic core of every form within this process is an SAP transaction. I'm simply going to record the SAP transaction via the GUI, complete a good transaction, and then at the end of that process, I will publish a web service. Now that web service will then be stored in that central environment. So as you recall earlier, I said that's a central access. It's a central database. So everything we create is stored there. So that web service is stored in that central environment. And as I mentioned earlier, that web service allows me, the user, to come in, to input data into a form, and then to call that web service, which is passed to SAP, which ultimately returns that information back to the user. As a designer, I'm going to take that web service, I'm going to model my workflow, I'm going to design my form, and then I'm going to publish that integrated form and workflow, which is then published back into that central SharePoint environment that makes it available for my end user to check out, to use, to consume. That's the process that you're going to see me walk through today. So let's come back to our forms environment. And I'm simply going to minimize this and this. And let's start with the design of our particular form. So what I've done here in preparation for the demonstration is really to record the transaction. So I went ahead and I recorded a basic material transaction, and we can take a peek at that if you like, so you can see the elements of the particular transaction. And as I said at the core, really basically all that's required of you in that process is to record a good transaction, whether that is whether that is a master data record or whether it is a transactional record, like a sales order or a purchase order. In this case, it's a material creation. And what you see is basically what you record in the process. I recorded material number, industry sector, material type, and I populated and changed these fields. And Winshuttle captured that recording of that particular transaction. And then what I'm able to do is I'm able to transform that transaction into a web service. Again, a very non-programmatic means to developing the web service. Winshuttle does all the heavy lifting for you. So if you remember my diagram, once I record that transaction and publish that web service, it's been stored in that central SharePoint environment. So now I have that available to me to incorporate in this form and workflow solution. So just a little bit of navigation here. What you see over here in this design area is, one, the place where we'll store the view of our form, two, the actual transaction that we recorded, and three, the deployment stages at which our solution is in. So you have the capability of creating a base solution and then improving that solution as you move towards production, all the time retaining all the building that you have used. So basically what we have to do is we have to say, okay, what is it we're trying to accomplish here? Well, we're trying to accomplish a new material create. Where do we want to store that particular information or our particular solution? And so I have selected our portal location that we were using earlier in the demonstration. And then it is how do we want this particular form to look, and what is the design of the form, what is the design of the workflow. Well, Winshuttle's again going to help you do this in a very non-programmatic way. So we have attached our particular transaction. We have determined where it is we want to store the location of our form and workflow. And now what we want to do is we want to take and we want to get that web service, and we want to start the process of creating our new form. So in Designer, I'll select my transaction, and then I will design a form from that transaction. Once I select that web service, you can see the recording of that particular transaction instantiated here in this design mode. So I'll say, okay, generate an info path form. All right, the form has successfully been generated. So now we can simply design it. So I'll just come here, and I'll edit the design of my form. So it automatically takes me to the Forms Designer. And in this Forms Designer, you'll see a panel to your right where my particular material recording is stored. To my form, I'll give it a title. And then I'll start the design of my form. And I'm just going to grab all these fields and bring them into my transaction or my form here. In this case, I have the option as to whether I want each individual user to store their credentials within the form, or I can assign them to the form within that central environment. So here are all my fields that are required for creating my new material. In addition, what I want to do is I want to bring in the log information from SAP. So we're going to create a simple version of the form. It won't be quite as extensive as the first example that I showed you. But we've designed here the form. Now what we need to do is we need to provide it with a bit of integration. One that will allow us to add or to publish that integrated forms and workflow process. So we're going to add our Winshuttle or our Winshuttle process control, and I also want to add the Winshuttle web service control or the SAP web service control to the process. And what this allows me to do is to call that particular transaction and send it to SAP and return that information back to the forms user, much like you saw in the demonstration. I will configure the web service properties here to say, when you see this web service control in this particular form, I want you to call this transaction or this particular web service. And there again we see it instantiated here. And when we press that button on that form, I want you to post to SAP. So we configured the properties of our web service. So what have we done here? We took our web service, we designed our form, and we added the process control and the web service control to our particular form. And we'll just save that. And we're finished with the design of our form. The next step in the process will be to design the workflow around this particular form. As I showed you earlier in the example, there were 5 or 6 different steps through the process. The originator, plant controller, accounting, and then the various people within the master data organization. Today we're going to create a kind of a simple two-step process, two-step approval process. So we've designed our form. We have determined where we're going to store this particular solution. And now what we want to do is design the workflow. Up here, again, in a very graphical, non-programmatic way, we have all the functions that have already been created for us within our designer solution. So here we'll start with the originator. So the originator is going to start the process. It's then going to be routed to the manager, who will then add the approval step. Now, in order to add additional participants in this process, it's really quite simple. If I wanted to add someone else to this particular process, I could simply click into a particular lane here and then add a new user. So here we can see all of the different users that we have currently in our process. So I could just simply add a new person to participate in the process. So one of the benefits of the solution is its flexibility and its adaptability to change. At any point in time, your transaction may change. You can simply go back into that map and add or delete fields as necessary. Maybe the forms change. We can just simply change the form's design in the designer, republish that back out for our end user. Or if the workflow process changes, maybe we add additional contributors, additional approvers or participants in the process. We can simply insert those, resave it, republish it. So we can really leverage all the work that we have already done in reaction to any changes that may be required in our business process. So now let's finish up with the end of our process. So I'm going to add a couple of possibilities here. To the originator, we're going to return the information and the notification. So I'll just put in here some email notifications. And let's diagram out our process. our new material will start with a material clerk. It'll go to the manager for approval, and then it will either be approved with an email notification back to the originator, or it will be rejected with an email notification back to the originator. Again, we've created a simple two-step workflow approval process. Yours may be more complex, just as was the example I showed you earlier. But we can add that complexity to the process. We can add participants. We can add process steps. We can add escalation procedures, notification, vacation escalation, so that complete integration with our users, both via that central environment and through email notification. So once we're pleased with our process, I'll just go ahead and save it. And so we've created our form, we've designed our workflow, and now what we're ready to do is really to design or to publish that integrated workflow into our central environment. We've already told our designer where we want to store it, and what we want to do is we just want to check it, make sure it validates and works against particular, okay, web services. Okay, all right. So what we have, we used our transaction here, our web service. That's okay. All right. So once we publish this solution into our particular environment, then we're ready to access it via the process cockpit. So back to that central environment. So let's go back to here. And as the end user, I can just simply select my particular form that we just created. And here it is. And here's the new material create form published. So we recorded a transaction, we published that web service, we consumed that web service and designed our form. We then designed a workflow process, and then we published that integrated workflow form here into this environment. So then we can just start by creating our new material. And if I remember everything, I'll be okay. We'll put a material group, maybe an old material number. And as I said, if these things change, we can simply adapt our transaction. We can adapt our and change our form. We can adapt and change our workflow to enable us to react to those particular changes. In this case, a pretty simple process. We're just going to route it to myself again. Once the material clerk has input data into the particular form, he routes it. And now we'll see the second step of the workflow we designed. And so here's the view. In this case, we didn't design multiple views, but we could have, much like the earlier example. But now we're just going to simply call our transaction and create our new material record within our SAP environment. And as you can see, material 88P-1002 was created in SAP. So a very non-programmatic approach to recording, designing forms and workflow, and then having a centralized access point where we can store all of this data and all of these forms for consumption. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it back over to Teresa, who will be taking your questions.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Teresa.
Perfect. So yeah, at this time, we'd like to answer any questions that you may have. Please feel free to provide any questions in the chat box displayed in the meeting window. And let's go ahead and get started here. So our first question is for you, Bill. What tool was used to build the workflow diagram?
So the workflow solution is part of the Winshuttle suite of solutions, and that is what we call the designer solution. And that's where it allows us to, one, determine what it is we're trying to automate. In this case, it was a material transaction. Two, where is it that we want to deploy that particular form? Three, how do we want our forms to appear? And four, how do we want our workflow to appear?
Perfect. Thank you, Bill. Our next question is, how is Winshuttle Solutions licensed?
So, John, do you want to take that question? Or
Hi, Teresa. This is John. I'll answer that for you. Hi. So the Winshuttle Foundation solution is set up as named user licensing for the authoring tools, and the authoring side is what Bill demonstrated the use of today. In terms of end users accessing the forms are set up like the Microsoft SharePoint licensing, their Cal seat licensing. So all of the users that play a functional role within the process of the workflow will have a seat license that would be assigned to them.
Perfect. Thank you, John. Next question geared towards you, John, again. Does Winshuttle have out-of-office delegations?
Yes, they do. They have the ability to set up notification or to route notification for second-line approval, if I'm understanding the question correctly. And maybe Bill can maybe address that in terms of if there is somebody that needs to be notified if somebody's missing in the approval process, that can be automatically set up.
Yes, you're correct, John, and that can be done both through that central SharePoint task list and that integration with your email service. So if there is a certain time frame for your approval that you can set in that design and it's not met, then it's escalated on to maybe someone else in that particular approval group who can then approve the workflow, because you don't want any hindrances, and you certainly want to expedite your workflow through the process.
Perfect. And I have another one for you, Bill. This person's not sure if they missed it or not, but how do you do mass updates for hundreds or thousands of data at one time?
So we didn't demonstrate, what we demonstrated today was a single master data record creation. There is also the integration with those Office tools that will allow us to upload hundreds or thousands of master data records or transactional data records. And basically the way that works within that same design process is, rather than a form being visualized, then what you would have is an Excel sheet that is exposed to all the participants, can be opened by the participants, participants can contribute to that particular Excel template and add data throughout the process. So there are a couple of ways of doing it, and I just chose today to show you the single data record form.
Perfect. Thank you, Bill. And our last question for John, can training be conducted on site, and how long does that usually last?
Yes, training can be conducted on site. Typically, we provide a 4-day on-site training, kind of a classroom atmosphere where we would work with you to build a curriculum that you would want to focus on and conduct the training. In terms of additional ongoing, we do provide, online tech support. We do have online training. So we offer a plethora of offerings in terms of, getting the client up to speed and working with the applications.
Perfect. And we have one last question. I can go ahead and address this. It asks, will you demonstrate mass updates at a later date? And we can actually circle with this person offline to, do this demonstration, maybe a one-on-one demonstration. And we do have upcoming webinars that we will be addressing this. So with that being said, if there's no more questions, we'd like to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you again for your interest in Adaptive Corporation and our workflow product. We are attending the Sapphire event come May 14th through the 16th down in Orlando, Florida. We invite everyone to come out and explore the new and exciting things that are happening around SAP and SharePoint. Thank you again, everyone, for your time today, and have a great rest of your day.